So welcome everybody to looking at how longitudinal population study data can actually be used in the policy landscape. And in this panel discussion, we'll focus very much on how it's used within Parliament. So we'll stop sharing the slides now and we'll get started. So my name's Hill-Cawthorne. My day job is as Director of Research for the House of Commons. And that essentially means that I look after the 8 research teams of the House of Commons Library, which I'll speak more about in a moment. Prior to that, I was head of the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, also in UK Parliament. And my non-day job, when the other side of the world is awake, is I'm Professor of Global Health at the University of Sydney. So with me on the panel today is Faten Hussein. Faten is Senior Committee Specialist in the House of Commons Scrutiny Unit. I've also got Tristan Stubbs, who's Clerk of the House of Lords Public Services Committee. And finally, Rob Davies, who is head of the closer COVID-19 task force and has been an academic fellow with the House of Commons. So he can give both a longitudinal study perspective along with an internal view of how we work. So I was going to start very briefly just outlining how Parliament gets scientific advice. So one thing to note from the start is Parliament MPs and parliamentary officials are interested in multiple types of evidence. So the most obvious, because we're all here talking today, is research evidence. So what does the actual evidence base as produced by science show about a key issue, and how does that shape policy? There is policy evidence. So this is usually the history of policy in that area. What's worked, what hasn't worked, what lessons have we learned? And as you'll find, policy tends to be quite cyclical. So things have been tried before, lessons have been learned. There hasn't always been the right environment for things to happen the first time round. And then the third thing, which we're also very interested in, particularly in committees, is lived experience. So what are the experiences of the general population? Are specific groups impacted by a policy more than others? And what's their experience of that in the real world? So that's evidence, but evidence I like to think of as one circle within a Venn diagram. And evidence lies alongside two very other important key elements that ultimately inform policymaking. So evidence, one circle. The other circle tends to be the values, needs, and preferences of the population at large. So ultimately, the people elect politicians, and so there is inherent political decision-making that has to be needed in that. People have values and needs that they want to see their politicians represent, and that's ultimately why they vote for a government. So that is very important and sits alongside evidence. The other is what I sometimes refer to as the pragmatism of policy. So resources and expertise need to be available to actually implement a decision. There's little point coming up with a policy out of thin air that it's not the right time for, either because you don't have material in terms of money or people like expertise within the country to actually deliver it. So evidence, values, needs and preferences, and resources and expertise are these three. But around all of that Venn diagram is the environment. And actually, I never had a very good illustration of this. And then we've had two recent good illustrations, which is Brexit a few years back and COVID even more recently. And so COVID, for example, has illustrated brilliantly how the once unthinkable policy making that you would never have used, like lockdowns, can suddenly be required. And so the scales within that Venn diagram shift slightly. So for this reason, I tend to talk about evidence-informed policy rather than evidence-based policy, because evidence is just one thing that contributes to policy making. And just to recognize that it isn't the be-all and end-all. So while we're going to talk a lot about evidence today and the very important part that can play, the lived experience of people within your longitudinal studies should be informing us, as well as these other elements. So how do we get evidence in Parliament? So we are generators of policy evidence. So the 8 library research teams that I lead cover everything from economics, statistical analyses, science, home affairs, social policy, international affairs and defense, and the Constitution. And they use published information that's out there to provide briefings. And these focus on new legislation, so explaining what legislation is and what underpins it and why it's happening, or looking back on how old legislation was implemented and the impacts of that. The teams also produce briefings on topical issues. So our most read one in the past couple of years is COVID lockdown laws, unsurprisingly, because no one can keep track of that. So it's useful to have it in one place. And debate packs to inform all sides within a debate what the key issues are when that's happening in the chamber. We also provide a confidential research service for MPs. So MPs can ask us literally any policy question that they have, and we'll try to give them an answer, or we'll help them answer difficult inquiries that their constituents might have gone to them with. So that's the library. Alongside the library is Post, which is its sister. Post is a parliamentary office of science and technology and is the main knowledge broker for Parliament. So it's Post that connects the rest of Parliament to the research community. And it helps us because it horizon scans for Parliament. So rather than just looking at published primary and secondary research, it also conducts interviews with academics to find out what direction science is going, and tells us and parliamentarians what we should be thinking about in the future, not necessarily right now. Post also has within it the knowledge exchange unit. So this really exists for the express purpose to connect you in academia as research producers with us in Parliament as research consumers. And so they teach academics how to have impact with their research in Parliament. They communicate opportunities for interacting with us, and they also help shape the impact landscape. So we want to make sure that the research landscape in the UK recognises your contributions to policy, and they've played an important part in that for REF and now KEF. So that's my very brief overview. And then there's two other incredibly important parts, which are the key effector arms of Parliament when it comes to scrutiny, which is through the two select committee systems, one in the House of Commons and one in the House of Lords. So I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to briefly describe their areas in more detail and what they do and how they use evidence. So I'm going to put Faten Hussein on the spot first to introduce the House of Commons committees. Thanks, Faten.
Thanks very much, Grant. My name is Faten Hussein, and as Grant mentioned, I'm a senior specialist in the Scrutiny Unit. Because a lot of people are not familiar with the Scrutiny Unit, I'll just speak a little bit about the Scrutiny Unit first, and then I'll introduce what I do here. In the Scrutiny Unit, we support the select committees in their work scrutinizing government policy, expenditure, and legislation. And we do this through a few teams. We have a financial team, we have a legal team, and we have a specialist/policy analyst team, which I lead. We also continuously think of ways to improve scrutiny. We think about what we do and how to make it better, and offer guidance and learning across select committees. We also support academic policy engagement, mainly in coordination with the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology. As Graham mentioned, it's our main avenue of coordinating with the outside world in terms of academic policy engagement. We also have a little bit of stuff that we do directly ourselves. For example, we facilitate fellowship schemes for academics into select committees. We have, as an example, one with the Political Studies Association and one with the UK Research and Innovation. In terms of my role, I have a few hats in the Scrutiny Unit. One of them is working on academic policy engagement. As part of I lead on the previous liaison committee's recommendation on improving our use of research evidence, and I also do this in coordination with Post. Prior to that, I was based in the international cluster, where I worked on international trade, international development, and I worked for the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy, looking into biosecurity, which that committee sits between the Commons and the Lords. And throughout our work, we engage with academics through our inquiry process that we do. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about what we do specifically. So I'm going to stop here and hand over to Tristan.
Thanks, Faten. So my name's Tristan, and as Grant said, I work for the House of Lords Public Services Committee. Just very quickly, just to give you an idea of the committee system in the Lords. So broadly speaking, we split into two broad headings. we have domestic focused committees and international focused committees. There used to be a large EU focused component of the Lords Committee activity, but obviously that's no longer as relevant. So the EU committee is much smaller than it used to be. In terms of the Public Services Committee itself, the committee was set up in February 2020. This followed a review of committee activity that felt that there was a gap in scrutiny around public services, the ability of committees in the Lords to look at public services in the round. So the remit of the committee is to look at all public services. The wording of the motion that led to the committee being set up suggested a focus on health and education, but in fact the committee has taken a much broader remit than that. I should add, I think we're going to come on to discuss in a bit more depth the difference between Lords and Commons committees, but it's important to note, I think, that Lords committees take a non-departmental focus, so they will look at public policy across government departments, whereas Commons committees tend to scrutinise the work of specific government departments. So the committee itself, there's 4 Conservative members, 4 Labour members, 2 Liberal Democrats and 2 crossbenchers. I am the clerk of the committee, which means I provide procedural advice to the committee as well as policy advice. I also manage the team. I've been working for the committee office now on and off for 10 years. I was seconded to the European Parliament to do a similar sort of job for a while, but other than that, I've been working on committees. I manage a policy analyst who is a generalist policy analyst, but we do have specialist policy analysts as well. And I also have in my team a committee operations officer who does the administration side of things. We first, as I said, we were set up in February 2020. That was just at the start of the pandemic, if you recall, and there was a bit of feeling among the committee members that they didn't want to do anything on COVID, but it soon became clear that actually COVID was going to affect everything that we plan to look at. So we decided to do a major inquiry into COVID and public services delivery, essentially. That then led to what we called Principles for Public Service Reform, and that's what's then informed the rest of the work that the committee's done. So including major inquiries on vulnerable children. We're about to begin an inquiry on tentatively titled A Public Services Workforce Fit for the Future. We've also done smaller pieces of work on procurement and commissioning, data sharing of public services, the funding of public services post-coronavirus, and levelling up on public services. The committee is beginning to have a success in terms of impact. It's a bit of a slow start, but we put a lot of work into developing networks, particularly with academics and universities. And it's now starting to pay off. We're starting to see a lot of media interest around things like levelling up in children. So it's getting there. Very happy to go into more detail on any of that stuff, and particularly how your research fits into our work. Thank you.
Thanks, Faten and Tristan. And then Rob Davies is here. He can talk a bit from the research supplier side, but also his experience working with us.
Thanks so much, Grant. Hi, everyone. As Grant said, my name is Rob Davies. I'll just do a quick intro now. We'll come on to some bit more detail and insights in the discussion. Hopefully, most of you will know me, but for those who don't, I'm close as knowledge mobiliser. And at a very basic level, my role is to increase the visibility of longitudinal population studies, data and research in the policy landscape, primarily within government and parliament, and use the evidence generated from LPS to inform and influence policy and decision makers. What you may not know, though, is for the past 12 months, I've been on a part-time secondment in Parliament, working in the House of Commons Scrutiny Unit with Faten, which has been a unique experience and quite the journey. I was talking to another fellow who's just finished their fellowship, and they described it as jumping onto a moving train. I think, you know, we will perhaps come on to it in terms of kind of pace and timings and things like that compared to the academic world. But I thought it was a great description of kind of what it's actually felt compared to, you know, for example, working in UCL. But for the fellowship, I've been supporting, Faten's mentioned this already, I've been supporting the implementation of the 2017 to 19 Liaison Committee's report recommendations on the use of research evidence in Parliament. For those of you who don't know what the liaison committee is, it's a House of Commons committee, and it's made up of the chairs of all the other committees. So it's a very senior and influential committee that often looks at kind of cross-cutting issues. And they're also the committee that scrutinises or questions, has sessions with the Prime Minister as well. The main aim of those recommendations was basically to diversify the research and evidence base used by select committees, leading to a more diverse witness base and ultimately more effective scrutiny of government policies. So I've been working on a few really exciting and interesting projects, which I think we'll come on to in a bit. And really the kind of one of the purposes of this session, I'm really keen to ensure that you all, the LPS community, benefits from not only what I've learned in the fellowship, but also to hear insights from colleagues that I've been working with, as you can see around the table today, who are also committed to increasing the diversity of research evidence in the scrutiny process and engaging with academia. So yeah, really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Great, thanks everyone. So feel free to start putting questions in the chat. I'm going to kick it off with a few basic things to set the groundwork. And so as a kind of starter for 10, why is it important that academics and researchers engage with Parliament? So I'll start with Faten on that question. Why do you want academics to engage with you?
Thanks, Grant. I think if you think of the main functions of Parliament, it's scrutinising government policy, checking and approving expenditure, doing legislative scrutiny, and debating issues of concern to the public. We can't do this without access to data and expertise by people who know far more about this than us. Academics, research institutions, and other outside scrutiny bodies like the Office for National Statistics, for example, do valuable work across policy areas. And Parliament relies on this sort of expertise to know where we need to focus our attention. As specialists, we do our bit of research, but we cannot gather in a couple of months what academics have been researching for years and years. When academics think of policy engagement, they tend to think mainly of engagement with the government. That's been mainly my experience when I talk to people. And I think they do this because it's like a tried and tested route. It makes it easy to take an impact box, say I engaged with the X department when they were formulating X policy, and they referenced my research, etc. I found that most academics are unaware of the role of Parliament in changing policies and legislation through the inquiries that we run, and how we ensure better implementation of these policies. That can have a much greater impact on policy than actually engaging with government. So it's sorry, I've lost my track of thought now. So it's important for academics to engage with Parliament because we need your expertise, and in return, you, as Rob, I'm sure will come to tell you, you also get to see how the stuff that you're working on gets put into practice firsthand. And just going back to the point that academics engage more with government than Parliament, I was on the most recent REF as an impact assessor, and I noticed that trend is shifting slightly, which is really good. I mean, it's good to see how more academics are citing engagement with select committees and what that led to as impact. Two other important points. One is our scrutiny of government is as good as the evidence we receive. And the more diverse evidence, the more voices we hear from, the more effective our scrutiny is going to be. Select committee reports that select committees publish and you hear in the news and that pushes government to respond and do something about a certain policy are agreed on a cross-party basis. And because there is the party politics there that hopefully the MPs try and leave outside the room before coming in, and they have to discuss everything and agree a consensus and a report that goes out as a consensual report is also as strong as the evidence that it's built on. And if we don't get enough information, that weakens our reports. And that's another reason why it's important. The final point I was going to make is, which a lot of people are not aware of, is we run a much smaller operation than government. Government is massive, they have a lot of resources, they can spend money on policy formulation and their consultations, etc. We don't. Each committee is supported by a small number of staff that are moving from one policy scrutiny area to the other. And we always really value academic contribution to our work exactly because of this. If someone comes and says, these are the areas you should be focusing on, saves me weeks of research that I don't have to start with, that is always hugely appreciated. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Faten. Same question to you, Tristan. Are there any differences, do you think, in the way the House of Lords want academics and researchers to engage with them?
I was just thinking Faten gave such a comprehensive argument that I can't really improve on it. But I was thinking as she was speaking about an example, though. I mean, I mentioned earlier that I was seconded to the European Parliament for a while, and this was during the Brexit, the original Brexit debates, I should say. I mean, during the referendum itself. And one thing that people always said when they heard that I was from the House of Lords and indeed from the UK Parliament was that they were very well aware of the reports that select committees in the UK Parliament produced about European matters. And so the reason that they were well thought of was because of they were based so much on the evidence that the committees received. And I think that's the sort of USP of the committees in both houses, and that process isn't that familiar to other parliaments, and it's certainly something that I think Parliament should be proud of. And indeed, that in itself offers an opportunity for researchers in the UK and outside to get their research to a broader audience and to have it make a policy difference, because, as I said, there isn't quite the same processes elsewhere. Just in terms of the potential difference with the Commons, I guess we might come on to discuss some of this when we discuss this question more with more focus, but in terms of the way we use evidence, I would imagine it's more or less the same. I completely concur with what Faten was saying about the difference between the way we use evidence and the way government does. One thing I would say to strengthen her points is that if you as an academic or a researcher are submitting evidence to a government consultation, then ultimately you're providing evidence for the government to make their own argument. Whereas if you're providing evidence to a select committee consultation, by definition, the argument will be based more on a consensus of political views. It will be reflecting something, hopefully, ideally, I should say, that's been discussed by politicians of all parties, and they've come to a view on it. So as a result, I would suggest that those arguments are sort of better evidenced and stronger than perhaps they might be if your evidence was used in a government consultation. But it's also a way, I think, going back to some of the points that Faten was making about sort of reflecting views and that being an almost responsibility of select committees. I think I've certainly found that, particularly when we start an inquiry into something that maybe hasn't been looked at by government or elsewhere in the public policy sphere, for example, by think tanks, we're really building communities of practice around that. So we're almost becoming a bit of a hub for researchers to start thinking about some of these ideas. And I think that's another important area in which we add value as select committees and add value to the research process, as well as researchers bringing value to the policy process.
Thanks, Tristan. Yeah, they're really good points. I'm going to change slightly now and just go to Rob, because you mentioned earlier some of the liaison committee recommendations around expanding the diversity and network of academics and researchers. And this was very much a recognition that 10 years ago, we tended to get the same people coming in front of committees who tended to have FRS after their name or fellowships like it. So can you describe, Rob, what you and Faten have been doing to try and diversify some of that work?
Absolutely, thanks, Grant. So as you mentioned, so the liaison committee found that there was a lack of diversity in stakeholder engagement, particularly in research expertise provided to select committees. And reading from a quote, this appears to be particularly the case for the academic sector, which is both underrepresented compared to other stakeholder groups and, crucially, underrepresentative of the breadth of the academic research community. So that's basically where the kind of driver for this has come from. So ultimately, we as a community and the evidence that our studies generate are massively underrepresented, which needs to change. And I think just very briefly, in terms of why is it important that we engage with Parliament? It's very much, for me, it's centred within the public, the public good, which we're all committed to ensuring that policy development and decisions are informed by the best available evidence. And from a researcher's perspective, engaging with Parliament, it's much more personal. It's been mentioned already. Compared to government, it's a much more personal kind of engagement. You're far more likely to kind of cut through. But it gives, as a researcher, gives you the opportunity to shape and change policy and the policy agenda, demonstrate the impact of your research, raise the profile of your research, broaden its dissemination, perhaps even get a different kind of perspective on your research. Get presented with new opportunities and new experiences. But crucially grow your network beyond the kind of academic bubble, basically. And it's been mentioned, I think select committees inquiries, in my experience, are one of the most effective and efficient vehicles that exist to surface your evidence in the policy landscape. It's much easier to demonstrate instrumental impact from your research. Engaging with Parliament than it is with government. Just very briefly, I respond to a lot of government consultations and select committee inquiries. With a government consultation, if your name isn't Ben Goldacre, or you're not from the Turing Institute or things like that, it's highly unlikely you're going to get a citation. You may get a little mention in these are the people that responded to the consultation. It's far more likely, as you've heard from the approach that both the House of Commons and House of Lords select committees take, and also Post and the Knowledge Exchange Unit and the libraries as well, that you will get a citation and that you will be directly influencing members of Parliament through your research. But kind of turning to kind of some of the things I've been working on. So one of the Liaison Committee's report recommendations to make it easier for the research community to engage with select committee scrutiny was the creation of documented and published areas of research interest in the same way that government departments do. So the thinking about this was they could both act as a signal to academic communities of the kind of broad areas of select committee interest and knowledge needs, form the basis for discussions with UKRI and other research funders about potential funding schemes to support academic responses. But ultimately, the publication of select committee ARIs is aiming to maximise the opportunities for participation by academics in the research sector and increase the diversity of research expertise, kind of feeding into the scrutiny process. So that's one of the main projects that I've been working on, basically. So Faten and I we've been working on that, and it's been a really interesting experience piloting areas of research interest to kind of explore and assess whether they can help not only diversify the evidence that's coming into Parliament, but increase it as well. So we've done a couple of ARI pilots, one with the International Development Committee and one with the International Trade Committee. And we've had really, really good response from that, a really good result. So just very briefly, 40% of the academics that responded to the Development Committee ARI had never engaged with Parliament in any way, shape or form before. So this was their first time engaging with Parliament. There's potentially different reasons for that, maybe the length of time that the ARIs were open for, the language that was used. It was kind of framed in terms of kind of open, very broad, kind of open questions. Got some great insights and suggested scrutiny questions or themes areas that the committee should be asking the government to improve government policy. And then with the Trade Committee, it was far more extensive ARI, 5 ARI themes with specific research questions in there. And we got a similar kind of result. I think it was just about 35% of respondents, again, had never engaged with Parliament in any way, shape or form before. Early career researchers kind of getting their voice heard as well. So a really, kind of interesting experiment. We're hoping to do a couple of more. I've got a few more months of the fellowship to go, so we're hoping to launch at least one other ARI during that time. For a home committee, you may have noticed both of those committees are kind of international, so we're keen to kind of test it with a home committee like health or education or women and equalities, for example. So that's the kind of main project that I've been working on. But we've also been doing some other kind of projects looking to kind of diversify the witness base, particularly in the academic sector. And that's been kind of looking at guidance, to witness guidance, for example, emphasizing or basically changing the language, the existing language that said that anything that's published, you can't basically use anything that's been published already, which is a real issue for us in the academic sector with preprints and the various other things that we produce. So we've changed that language now to make it much more clearer that whilst you have to create an original document, a summary of your research or what have you for the committee, you can refer to your published research and kind of pull in, preprints, evidence that's coming in from your preprints as well, and get that in front of the committee, and the committees will accept that. So yeah, there's been a few other things as well, but I think I'll stop there and move the conversation along. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I was going to go to Tristan next, just to talk a bit more, because you touched upon the differences between how the House of Commons and House of Lords committees work, and also just to pick up a question in the chat about who actually sets up the select committees in the UK.
Well, I'll take that first. I mean, so that in the Lords, the select committees are appointed. So we've just gone through this process. In fact, what happens is that the whips of the various parties in the Lords, and also in the Lords, we have a group called the crossbenchers, which don't belong to any party. Their convener, their organisers, and the whips of the parties themselves will make some suggestions as to who will be on committees. We have a certain number of committees, and there tend to be 12 people on each, so that there are only a finite number of spaces to go around. I might leave Faten to talk about the Commons, but that's essentially an elected process, and the chairs of the Commons committees are elected by the whole House. What the Lords, because it's an appointed process, and because there are only a finite number of seats on these committees, we have what's called a rotation rule. So members are only allowed to stay on each committee for 3 years before they rotate off, and chairs are allowed to stay for a bit longer by dint of the fact that they've been a chair. But other than that, members rotate off, and which gives other members the chance to be on committees. Again, that's slightly different from the Commons, where they stay for all of Parliament. Just in terms of the sorry, Grant, the question was about the differences, was it?
Yeah, your focus or approach and how that might differ.
So as I briefly mentioned at the start, the Lords committees don't have a departmental focus. So if you know anything about Commons committees, you'll be aware that they have names that closely track the names of departments in government. So for example, you have the Health and Social Care Committee, which scrutinises the Department for Health and Social Care. In the Lords specifically, they don't do that. They specifically try to scrutinise the work of a number of departments, which the Lords believes add value to the process of select committee scrutiny. So for example, with Public Services Committee, we might be looking, we might be taking evidence from ministers from the Cabinet Office, from the Department for Education, Department for Health and Social Care, Department for Levelling Up Housing, Levelling Up Housing and Communities, as it now is. I always forget that one. The other things to remember, that this appointed process means that there's less of the sort of what you might be familiar with when you think about select committees, which is the sort of major media events that come out of select committees that tend to make the news. They tend to be Commons committees where they might have a high profile figure like, for example, Russell Brand or somebody like that. Or it could be a high profile politician. So for example, when the Home Affairs Committee forced the resignation of the former Home Secretary. These are sort of more combative understandings of what a select committee meeting is like, then frankly, pretty much any Lords Select Committee evidence session and most Commons Select Committee evidence session. The reason that that is the case in the Lords is because, as I say, the members are appointed, both the committees themselves, but also to the House. So I think they feel that there's less need to sort of appeal to their constituents. They're not thinking about being re-elected, frankly. What that also means, I think, is that they feel that they're therefore able to take a sort of longer term view of things. And this is where research evidence comes in, particularly longitudinal research evidence, because House of Lords committees tend to, their inquiries last a bit longer than Commons committees. We have what are called special inquiry committees, which are set up for a whole year, looking into a particular topic of public policy. And the idea is, because the House of Lords is appointed, and the members are often appointed to the House of Lords based on their expertise, often in public policy areas, that they can bring that experience to the process of scrutinising government policy. So that there's that aspect to it. The other thing, as I mentioned, there's only 3 people per team, whereas House of Commons committees have a lot more than that. What that means is, again, there's only a certain amount of time that we have to do inquiries, and that tends to mean that our inquiries last longer. It also means that we rely more on outside help, I think. So we're relying a lot on the advice provided to us by specialist advisors who we might appoint to help with inquiries over the course of the inquiry. We rely on, just frankly, networks that we've developed with policymakers, but also with academics. So again, there's an opportunity there for academics and researchers to get their research evidence into Parliament. And lastly, there is a sense, as I briefly touched on in my answer to the previous question, the House of Lords is governed by, it likes to see itself as being governed by self-regulation and consensus. So it's very rare that you would have a vote on a select committee report in a committee of the House of Lords, which is to say, the sort of that would basically be a failure of my job, and the members and the chair would see it as a failure themselves if there was to be a massive split in opinion in the committee. So there is the main thing to try to achieve when you're drafting and agreeing a report is to achieve consensus. And what that means is, we would like to think, is that there is a more balanced view of the role of research evidence and the way that we use that research evidence when coming to our conclusions. That's not to suggest that the Commons is more divisive or anything like that. Mostly reports are agreed by consensus as well. And again, it's seen as a bit of a failure not to agree something by consensus. But the idea that the Lords takes a considered long-term view on things is very much what motivates select committees in the Lords, I think.
That's a really good point. Thanks, Tristan. I was just going to come to you, Faten, and also just pick up on comments. It says select committees by design reach a balanced view, which makes them very suitable for research evidence. But what's the next step? So a report is produced. Does the government ignore those recommendations? What happens if they do? And what's your kind of effector arm of the committee from then on?
Just to speak to how select committees are composed and all of that first. So they are composed of backbench elected officials. So we have all of the elected MPs. Out of these, you have the ministers, the secretaries of state, the prime minister, and everyone else who sits on the backbenches. They have a place in select committees that are divided by policy areas. As Tristan alluded to, each committee mirrors a government department. So you'll have the International Development Committee used to mirror what was the international development, what used to be DFID, the Department for International Development, and so on and so forth. We have a few exceptions, like I mentioned IDC, International Development Committee in particular, because it remained, but it now has a wider remit on development spending generally across departments. We have the Public Accounts Committee, the Environmental Audit Committee. These sit across departments. However, the norm is that we mirror departments and we scrutinize their policies and expenditure. They are the names are put forward by the parties themselves, and it's based on a proportional calculation. The largest department, the largest party obviously gets a bigger number of members on each committee. And the chairmanship or chairwomanship of each committee, as Tristan said, is elected by the whole parliament, and this therefore it has an additional authority. And even though they have party affiliation, and there is also another calculation to decide how many committees go to which parties, they're supposed to act neutrally and kind of manage the committee business. They do interfere if it comes to a vote, but as Tristan mentioned, it hardly comes to a vote. If a specialist have done their job properly, voiced both sides of the argument and put together and consulted quite a lot during the process, it hardly ever comes to a vote, but it's not unheard of and it can be quite feisty. to respond, and the point about them being elected officials also is that they do bring their constituency interests into the committee, but it has to fit within the remit of the committee, and it has to be something of importance. It cannot just be a constituency issue, because constituency issues can also get voiced in other ways, like in the chamber or in other means. The point that Raj was making, that is fair enough. The government is obliged to respond to our reports within a set period of time. They can accept, reject, or they can just be neutral. However, first they have to respond. The inquiry process itself is where the power lies. So as we go on, if there's an evidence session coming, they think about how their policies and expenditure and all of that will stand to scrutiny, and they prepare, and they might shift course before they even come. So we impact the process of policy making throughout the inquiry process. The report is just the final bit of it. As Tristan alluded to, media interest, how much media engagement we do, how much kind of beating the drum we do, generate public interest, may force the government to do something, even though they could easily ignore our recommendations because it's not legally binding to them. It will look bad if both major parties as well as other parties and independent members of parliament on one committee agrees on something and the government just ignores it at face value. They have to say something, and if they're ignoring it, they will have, we can force them to say why they're ignoring it, and so the influence doesn't only come from that report. One thing we've been thinking about recently is how to do more follow-up on our recommendations, see what the government has done with them. The ones they said they were going to, they have accepted and they're going to do something about it. How can we actually follow up and see that they have? And if not, how can we follow up with a one-off evidence session and so on? So that's how they're composed, how we work. The way we decide which inquiries to take on is a mix of our own research, is a mix of suggestions coming from academics, is a mix of what's on the news. Sometimes, as Raj said, some people bring not Raj, sorry, someone in Aisling, I think. Some people do bring their pet projects into a committee. And again, everyone has to agree, every single member of the committee has to agree to take that forward in either case. As with the government, advisors advise, ministers decide. In our sales committee system, the specialists can advise, but the members have to decide which inquiries to take forward, and we have to support them with this. If someone leaves, it doesn't mean that the inquiry stops. We still carry, because it's in the name of the committee as a whole. The only time we will stop an inquiry is if a general election happens. This is when everything stops and we have to start afresh, because the existing committee becomes the previous committee, and then the new committee decides afresh what they're committing to look into.
Thanks. I was going to go back to Tristan because he's got his hand up.
Thanks. Just to come back quickly on the point that Raj was making, just to turn the question around slightly, I think we can think about impact in a number of different ways, which is what Faten was alluding to. And some academic research has been done into this, onto how do you measure select committee effectiveness in terms of policy influence. Frankly, similar to the Commons, we have even fewer resources, so it's more difficult for us to track our effectiveness. I'd love to be able to do that, but we would basically need somebody to come in and do that for us, and we haven't quite reached that point yet. But if you look at it in terms of, if you're submitting some research evidence to Parliament, and you're also submitting research evidence to government, how do you as a researcher have an influence on public policy? I would argue that you're essentially having more influence if you submit it to a parliamentary select committee, and then that's published, and then that goes into a recommendation that the committee makes, than if you submit it to a consultation and it sort of disappears into the ether, and the ultimate policy that emerges from that process depends on whatever the political priorities of the minister are anyway. So that's one way of looking at it. That essentially goes to the question of what is public policy. Is it something that the government does, or is it something that is created by a number of different institutions and that might have a bit of an effect later on in terms of moving the dial on the policy? The other point is what is the point of a select committee? Now, we could all write recommendations that we know the government would respond to, because they would be recommendations that we know the government would agree with. We could write recommendations that the government, so that say what the government is doing is brilliant, for example. But that's not necessarily what we should be doing, and indeed what the evidence is leading us to. So if we are, I'm not entirely convinced that having an impact on government policy itself is necessarily what we should be judging ourselves by, because sometimes it's about giving voice to people who might not otherwise have a voice in the parliamentary process. Sometimes it's about reflecting research evidence that otherwise might not have had any influence on government. So I think there are a number of considerations to take into account when we're thinking about influence.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to go to Rob next to also cover a question, which is how do you actually do this and build a relationship? Because obviously Rob is the expert here at building a relationship with Parliament. He even managed to infiltrate us. So what advice would you have for academics or researchers who want to engage?
Thanks, Grant. It's a great question. I think I just very briefly start off with the kind of challenge. I often talk about the kind of policy impact challenge, and I collect quotes along my very a few decades now kind of journey to kind of illustrate that. And this is from across kind of government and Parliament. But the key one from a government official is most day-to-day policy work rests on the twin pillars of Google and asking people we know. Next one, from a government advisor, I'm more likely to be asked by a minister to comment on a podcast or a newspaper article, rarely on an academic report. And finally, from a member of Parliament, I'm sick to death of getting academic briefings that are just full of jargon. So I think it's useful to kind of think about that. So in the research world, we talk about how data needs to be discoverable, usable and useful. And the same principles for me apply to academics in the policy world. You and your research needs to be visible, accessible and relevant. So a few kind of, basically you need to adapt your language for the target audience. You need to enhance academic papers with more accessible content. And a way to kind of look at that is through the wedding cake approach or the taste, snack, feast. So if you think of layers in a wedding cake, the feast is an academic paper or the data, the metadata, if you like. A snack is a blog, something a lot more accessible, basically, that can be read in a few minutes by very, very busy people. And a taste is a tweet, for example, or a kind of tweet thread, which recognizes that most of the people that you're trying to engage, parliamentarians, policymakers, even those in government, Twitter is their main kind of platform for communication. It's their so you meet them where they're where they're interacting, and the importance of trusted sources in the policy landscape. So basically, very, very briefly, you have to make yourself and your research discoverable, so visible. It's really important to increase your visibility so policy and decision makers, parliamentarians and people who work in Parliament can find you. And that basically means getting involved. So, leave aside the imposter syndrome, which I know we all get. You are an expert in your field compared to those who you are trying to influence and engage with. So sign up to expert databases, engage with the scrutiny process by submitting written evidence to select committee inquiries, write blogs about your research and make yourself you and your research visible on social media. It's absolutely crucial to kind of make connections and build relationships, really important to build up a network beyond your kind of academic research bubble. So one of the best ways I found to do that is by attending kind of policy focus events. And doing this, we've kind of talked a little bit about this, it helps you become more attuned to the audience that you're aiming to influence. So you kind of pick up on the issues that they're interested in, what motivates them, the kind of language that they use. And I think finally, it's about accessibility. So the people that we're trying to influence, basically the people we're trying to communicate, they don't occupy our world. They don't occupy the research world. They have a different culture, speak a different language. They never ever want to hear the words more research is needed when they're looking for kind of practical policy recommendations that can be implemented in a political cycle, for example. So to cut through, you really need to adapt your language, jargon free, plainly written, focused on solutions rather than just diagnosing the problem. And I found the most compelling way to get a message across is to combine evidence from longitudinal studies with compelling stories and case studies to kind of emphasize real world context, using visuals and infographics to really increase the chance of getting it noticed. That kind of relates back to the taste, snack and feast again. You know, an infographic is a taste, you know, you can, you know, it's very impactful. And I think basically, you know, remember that kind of policy impact takes time, and this relates to the churn question, and I kind of alluded to it slightly earlier on. In terms of, I found that Parliament, and Tristan's spoken about this as well, is the most effective, efficient way of basically generating policy impact. There is a huge amount of churn in policy in government departments. Most people that you engage with kind of are on the fast track scheme, so they'll disappear in 6 months basically. Whereas Parliament, it takes a much, particularly now, takes a much longer term view. People, you know, Tristan, you know, mentioned he's been, you know, in Parliament for like 10 years. You know, there are many people within the select committee team, within the kind of support teams, that have been in Parliament, yes, perhaps working in different teams, but it's so small. It's basically the same, you know, the kind of same team. Parliament is, you know, in total, I think about 3,000 people, and that's across all the teams. You know, participation, the select committee teams, you know, comms, IT, etc. So as you said, there's only a handful of people kind of working on this compared to huge government departments with economists, analysts, comms people, policy people, etc. So yeah, basically building relationships and networks with those, you know, with Parliament, and producing basically, you know, digestible content using accessible language helps you cut through. But I think if there's one thing that you do, it's focus on your visibility. You have to be discoverable. Grant mentioned the kind of usual suspects, and that was one of the points about the liaison committee, that understandably, this isn't a criticism, that very busy people basically use those twin pillars, Google, and asking people that they know and that they trust. So you have to get yourself into a position where you are visible, they can find you. And, you know, ultimately, there is a question whether researchers should be doing this or people in kind of my role should be doing this, is building relationships and trust with those people, with the actors within Parliament, and also the policy world. I think just on a broader level, is a point I like to make. There's more for it. It's not just about us. It's not just about us, and it's not just about Parliament. And this is another aspect that we've been kind of exploring in the during the fellowship. That there's a lot more for research funders to do around incentives for academics and the research community to engage with the scrutiny process through select committee inquiries, and now ARIs as well, parliamentary select committee ARIs. So this type of activity, it really frustrates me, because this type of activity should be seen as important, if not more important, than getting press coverage for a research paper and rewarded in such. And inquiry submissions need to be recognised in the systems that we use to demonstrate our work. So I don't want to mention ResearchFish, because I know that it's open now, yeah, we'll all be working on that over the next couple of months. But you know, it may sound a kind of glib point, but there's no box to tick for Parliament. Basically, there's a box to tick for government, but not for Parliament. And on the other side, as a bit of a challenge, you know, kind of select committees, you know, could do more to kind of demonstrate where expert advice has been vital to their work, kind of moving beyond citation. And again, we've done some work on that. We had a roundtable, really useful round table session before Christmas on that of kind of, and there again, it kind of relates back to my original point that, a point that I made earlier, that there is a real kind of commitment within Parliament across, you know, within posts, within, you know, the House of Lords and House Select Committees, to really increase, the use of research evidence, to grow their networks beyond the usual suspects, and try and acknowledge, you know, how academics have influenced and engaged with the scrutiny process beyond a simple kind of citation in a final inquiry report. So there's a lot more to come, and I'm really pleased, and I'm very confident that over the next few years we'll see a lot more progress in that area, which will benefit not just us in the research world, but obviously kind of benefit Parliament, and ultimately benefit our country as well.
I think that's a very positive note to end on. So thank you very much to all of our speakers, Faten Hussein, Tristan Stubbs and Rob Davies. And in the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to hand over to Laura to present her drawings that she's been doing during this.
Thanks, Grant. Hello, everybody. My name's Laura from Nifty Fox, and I've been scribbling away in the background, and I'm going to go backwards slightly. So don't panic, everything's still here. And voila, here we go. So here's where we started the beginning with Grant talking about evidence in Parliament, and we looked at the different kinds of evidence, so policy evidence, research evidence, and lived experience. And he painted this beautiful picture in our heads of this Venn diagram of what evidence-informed policy actually looks like. So it's not just evidence that informs policy, but it's also the pragmatism of policy, and also the values, needs, and preferences of our society and that of the government too. And we touched briefly on what Post does with Horizon Scanning as kind of the knowledge brokers for Parliament and how academics can get engaged directly, and also talked about impact training and that kind of policy knowledge mobilisation work that they do in order to get academic evidence into Parliament. We then looked at the role of the select committees and the scrutiny team and how academic links are crucial to making decisions around the effectiveness of policy, and also briefly touched upon public services committees and how they're split into domestic and international kinds, and that they operate differently within the Lords and the Commons. And there's been a recent paper on the principles for good public services committees too. Then we briefly looked at Closer and how the focus is on improving research visibility in Parliament and how research evidence can be used effectively. And actually this key focus at the minute is around the importance of the diversity of research evidence and people who are acting as witnesses. We then had our discussion and we had kind of 5 key questions, 4 of which are on here. So we looked at why is the policy and Parliament academic engagement so important? And I loved a quote that was said around our scrutiny of government is only as good as the data we receive. And that was kind of the underpinning principle. If there's a good relationship, then academics can give us more data in order to do our job more effectively. So we need that data for decision making, for focusing our attention on the right things. And there was a lot of discussion around Parliament being a greater route to impact for researchers than focusing on government, because there's more personal relationships, there's more opportunities to be involved in inquiries. And there's greater need because the teams are smaller. There is a need for academic resource to help build these communities of practice and have this kind of reciprocal value in that relationship. We then looked at how to improve evidence diversity. And again, Parliament came up as a route to greater impact, and the importance of ARIs, or areas of research interests, as signals to academics that this is what we need help with, which it seems from the evidence that was provided is improving engagement and improving witness diversity too. We then had a quick rundown of how does select committees work in the bottom right here, and especially in the Lords, they're elected by the whole House. There's this 3-year rotation of members, and they don't have a departmental focus, and there's a longer process of an inquiry, often because they have a smaller team. And again, this is an opportunity for academics to come in and kind of bolster some of that data and evidence, and decisions are made on consensus. And then how are recommendations implemented in this bottom element of the picture here. We've got the policy influence needs to happen throughout the inquiry process. So academic evidence is part of that. There's media kind of involvement that's part of that, with the report being the final step that's submitted to government. And then the government receives these recommendations, and sometimes there is a follow-up on that. So the 4 key questions there. And then we finished with how can we build academic and Parliament relationships? And as a visual storytelling company focusing on researchers, this was music to my ears, because to connect, you must make your research visible, accessible, and relevant. And that means no jargon and being operational on Twitter at the very least. And I really like this visual metaphor of the wedding cake approach. So thinking of the feast as your paper, the snack as a blog, and the taste as a tweet, or something that's very, very accessible. And the importance of building networks and trust so that you're top of mind over Google or Twitter to come to for advice and guidance, and being discoverable, being out there on social media. And it'd be remiss of me to not plug what we do at Nifty Fox, which is help make your research accessible, more visual, so that you can get in front of policymakers and Parliament more effectively. So check us out if that's something you need any help with. But thank you for having me, and all of these will be up on the link that I'll pop in the chat momentarily. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Laura. That's a very impressive summary of our whole talk. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And I hope you have a good day and it's not too cold out wherever you are. So thanks so much for joining us on this discussion around policy and longitudinal studies. Thank you.